Let's go and talk about how to take better notes, because I remember when I was a student, I was not a very good test taker. I'm sorry, I was not a very good note taker. My notes would be completely messed up. And even though a lot of times I could listen to my teacher, I understood what was going on in class. I remember coming home and looking over my notes, be like, oh, I don't have to worry about my homework. I'll do it late at night before I go to bed. And I'd go back and get my homework, try to go and do it, look at my notes and being like, what did I write down? I thought I understood what went in class, but then when I went to try to do the work, I tried to understand my notes. It didn't make any sense. And unfortunately, there was not a lot of advice on like how to take notes. Like basically the best advice up to that point was like, just write down what the teacher was writing on the board, right? And that's what most teachers or like anybody else would say to me. So I was kind of lost as a student. And I improved on my note-taking abilities by learning some things that kind of work for me. And those are some things that I want to share with you guys in this video. Now, some other things though that I think really changes once I became a teacher. And when I became a teacher, I kind of fell into the way that I was taught, right? And I think that a lot of teachers do that as well. Even though we have training and we go through all these educational courses of, how to teach in general, how to be a better teacher and teach mathematics, you a lot of times just kind of fall back on what you're used to. And I did kind of go through a growth of like, how did I want my students to absorb the information in class? And even though I started off with this very traditional approach of like writing down a lot of stuff on the board and having my students copy it, I quickly kind of remembered myself as a student and realized that method did not work for me. And so why am I just repeating that for my own students? And even though there are some students that, they just might prefer that, they don't want to talk, they don't want to engage, they don't want to really do it, they just want to show up to class, get the notes and get out of there. Those students a lot of times would be vocal against doing any other kind of note-taking, kind of tips or what I would advise for them. But what I found was like, that's not the best use of our time inside the classroom. Like I want to be doing some math. I want to be helping you answering questions and investigating, engaging and practicing. I don't want to be spending our time in class of you just recopying stuff that I write down on the board. So I had to change my approach with teaching. And I also had to change my approach for how I wanted my students to prepare for the classroom. So what we're going to talk about in this video is 4 ways that you can improve your note-taking ability. And it's mostly going to be geared towards math, but it really, I bet a lot of these can be applied for any class that you are taking. And the first thing comes down to, I think, something that is universal about everything is just coming in prepared for the class. I know a lot of times we come into class, we're like, all right, the class I'm going to learn, so I'm just going to sit down and see what's going to happen for the day. And then, there's very low lift that you can just show up and start writing down notes. It's easy. You don't have to think about it. And a lot of times it just kind of helps you get through the day. But if you want to become somebody that's really, really good at taking notes, I think one of the most important things is you can do is be prepared. Go back and review what you had previously done in the class. Don't just show up and just like, all right, time to learn, right? Go back, look back through your notes. Go back and look ahead. Look at the book that you're having. Try to go ahead and see what the current topic and what the professor or what you are going to be looking at. Like a lot of times you're going to have a syllabus, so you know what content you are going to be doing. A lot of the stuff you might already know offhand, or it's going to connect to stuff that you previously did. So go ahead and review over that content. It doesn't take a lot of time. This can be something that can be anywhere from like 5 to 10 to 15 minutes of just a little bit of prep work. Can really, really help you go ahead and not only take better notes, but also absorb the information. So as you are inside a class, right, you kind of know what to expect, what's happening. You also kind of have a little bit of context of what your teacher is teaching inside the classroom. And guess what? You're going to be able to add that context or those connections down in your notes, right? You just don't want to be copying down things, because if you forget that context, that's what a lot of times is going to when you kind of forget that, that context and stuff like that, that's a lot of times is what you forget. You write down the content, but it doesn't really make sense. You don't really know how it relates to anything that you were doing. So when you have a little bit of prep work, or when you have some time to do some prep work, take advantage of that. Now, the next thing that I think is really important, that I think is very difficult, I think for a lot of sometimes students not to have, but one thing that I had to do is I remember I had a lot of students with like, they had like IEPs, and one of the things that they would require on their IEP was to have like pre-filled notes or like notes already prepared. And a lot of times in my early years of teaching, I just kind of like winged it. Like I knew what I was going to teach. I had my problems, and I would just go up there and teach. And that was good. But then once it happened was when students had an IEP or students were like, hey, we're going on vacation for 2 weeks. Can you send us over the notes? I was like, crap, I don't have all of this prepared. And so that's when I started coming up with like my pre-calculus course and just like, you know what, let's just create all these notes and let's have them available for the students. And I realized, ladies and gentlemen, that not all teachers are going to have their notes already prepared for you. But I really do think if you can, even if that may be the case, you can kind of go back to, section 1 and kind of like creating an outline, maybe even having some of the notes, if you can have anything downloaded or pre-filled or anything else that you don't have to write vigorously of what's going down in what's going down in the class. I think what can be really important, sometimes about that is like even teaming up with somebody else inside your class that can maybe focus on, one part of the notes, and then you can focus on another part of the notes, which I'm going to get to next. And so therefore you kind of have like the core content that hopefully should be always provided ahead of time that you can download and already have with there. And therefore then you can focus on some of like the intricacies of like what the teacher is saying and trying to go ahead and like adding in that context. Because I think it's really important that we fall into this trap of whatever the teacher is writing down the board, we want to be able to write down. But I think the most important thing is when the teacher is writing things down the board, you want to be listening. You don't want to be spending your time always having to be writing things down. So if there's anything that you can have to already have down in your notes, so therefore when the teacher is doing their teaching, they are writing stuff on the board or like writing a definition, like you already have it written down. Therefore you can be present in the moment. Because I found a lot of times when I was a student, I would drift off. I would just, I would daydream and things would get boring, especially in a math class. And so I think it's really, really important to be present. And one of those best ways to be present is to have not only be prepared with, reviewing the previous notes and what's coming up, but to also have some things already pre-filled. So if you have those kind of like blank notes that you can kind of work with, I think that's really, really important to be able to take better notes. So those are going to be the first two things when you are getting into like basically just going through notes in your class. Not to focus on what is writing everything down on as the teacher is saying it, but try to focus in on like those little things, those little important contexts, because that's the thing that when you go home at night and you're trying to remember what you wrote down or why that formula or that theorem is helpful here, those are going to be the things that you're going to want to write down your notes so that it can click for you and therefore you can better understand things. Now, the next thing that I think is really, really important that I found out when I was in college that I needed to do, and this was kind of one of those things that I didn't understand it when I was in high school, and I didn't do it because obviously I was always in sports and I was so busy, so I was always doing all these other things. But once I got into college, this was like one of those tips that I think is extremely important that I was able to do right after class ended. I would always go ahead and do my homework, and I'd always go back and review my notes. Because again, you're in the moment, right? It's just kind of like, when you watch like a motivational movie or something like that, like how do you feel right after that? You feel motivated, right? And then you can think like a week, or you're like, all right, I'm going to go ahead and do this and I'm going to do that. And if you don't take action immediately on those thoughts and those feelings, a week, 2 weeks, months, a year goes by, and you're like, oh crap, oh yeah, I remember that. Yeah, I was going to go and do that, and I never did it, right? So you got to take action. And so I think it's really, really important not only to do your homework, yes, of course, but we're talking about notes here. And so what I would highly recommend is a lot of times when you go through a math class, your brain can just be like a mush. Even if you do everything that I said in step number 1 and step number 2, your brain can just be like, you feel overwhelmed. You're like, I am just burnt out from that class. I just absorbed all of this information. And you're like, I need to like relax. I need to like, exhale, right? Step away and go and do that. Get out of class, but hopefully you don't have to go exactly to another class, or maybe you can do it after school, or, go to a tutor lab or whatever may be the case. But right after that, go back and review those notes, because I guarantee you there's going to be some things that you're like, yeah, that makes sense. Let me go ahead and maybe write in some extra things onto this of what I remember the teacher saying that I didn't have time to write that down. Or maybe even looking back on those notes, you can add in some questions like, hey, this isn't making sense right now. Let me go ahead and maybe like write down those questions, like why they're not making sense to you at that, like in there. So therefore you have an idea of when, it's time for you to do your homework, or, later on that night, you can go back and kind of explore those things. Or you can go and, get some help, from a tutor or a parent, or, even to your professor. that I think it's really important to don't just like take your notes, get done in class, shove it in your notebook, and then don't look at it for 4 or 5 hours later. We don't want to do that. All right. So make sure you're trying to take action immediately. Review those notes, add to those notes as quickly as you can. Take a little break, but try to go back because I guarantee you can add some things to those notes to make you remember and understand what it is just happened in class, because class can sometimes be overwhelming, as I mentioned. And the last thing that I don't think is as important to do immediately, but I think it is really important for those of you that are coming up with like exams, coming up and you're coming into studying or you want to do your homework or you're getting ready for your test, is to rewrite your notes. I love one thing I talk about was creating the cheat sheets. And that is taking all of your notes and condensing them down to one sheet of paper. Now, that is great, and many students love it, but that might not be something that you want to do. You might be like, I just don't, I like that, or, an idea, and that's fine. But I do think if you can go back through your notes, at least once or twice, and when you're kind of reviewing them and looking them over, start to maybe try to think about them as like, if you were to, and the mindset that I would tell my students is, every year, sometimes I remember we had I was in high school and we were like done with like our junior year or something. And we had like a bonfire at the end of the year. And I remember some people were like taking their notebooks and like throwing them in the fire. And it was all this fun. Like, yeah, school's over. Like, we're done. Like, summer's here. And like, all this notes and all this knowledge was just thrown in the fire. Like, dang you, school. Like, we're done with you. And which is cool, which is funny, right, at the time. But then I kind of thought about it. I was like, in this digital age, and obviously content is much more prevalent now in the internet. But I was like, go back and like go through your notes like you're going to sell them. And maybe you can. Like I know there's online websites. Nothing's coming to my mind at the moment, but I know there's like where you can sell your notes, right? And immediately, if I looked at my notes that I took during class, they would not be something that I could charge a good, pretty penny for. However, I know a lot of people that put in a lot of time into organizing their notes and making them really, really good notes that would benefit other students. And so I kind of go through this mindset of like, when you take your notes, that's fine. That's for you, right? But if you can rewrite your notes, if you can re-summarize your notes, maybe for a cheat sheet, I think that's great. Or if you don't want to condense them all that way, but you just want to be able to rewrite them and present them as something that you would particularly like sell, even if you're not going to sell them, just going through the process of rewriting, condensing, and summarizing your notes, making them much more presentable, takes your brain going back through that motion again and is going to make things better for you to understand your notes. Because how many times have we gone back, looked at our notes and been like, oh yeah, that theorem or the formula, it was somewhere on here, and you're like flipping through pages, trying to find it, right? And that's fine. Like in the heat of the moment when you're trying to take as much knowledge as possible, like that's going to happen, right? There's no like trick that I can obviously give you. Just like immediately you're going to take better notes. But I truly believe if you are prepared for note taking, if you have that mindset, if you've reviewed everything, if you have the immediate content already written down, or maybe if you split your notes with somebody else and they take that content and you can write them down and then you guys combine your notes, if you summarize your notes immediately and then go ahead and condense them and review them right afterwards, that can make you a better note taker. And so I hope this advice you guys can use to become better at note taking. And if you have any other tips that you have used or that you have seen other people have success with, then let me know down in the chat down below, because I'm interested to hear what you guys came up with. But if you have any other questions, then feel free to post them into the chat and I'll be happy to answer your questions.